Hi everyone, welcome to our Globalization module. I personally love this module. I just think there's so many interesting things about it. The nice thing about this course is, I think once you get out of the sort of first three theories, you can start to talk about some more interesting topics, maybe more sort of contemporary issues, philosophical issues, that have a certain resonance with contemporary issues. I mean, we live in a time where a lot of the things that really haven't been up for grabs the last decade or so suddenly seem to be back on the table. And I think the globalization module really picks up on a certain tension that hangs in the air in the post-Cold War era. And I don't think you'll find it partisan of me to say that those questions that are in the air today that haven't been really permitted to ask since, say, 1989, have been kind of rediscovered, especially in 2016 with the campaign, the anti-establishment campaigns for election of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. You see two kind of discourses returning to the stage that really just haven't been around for a long time. It hasn't really been something you can speak about in America. Just thinking about Bernie Sanders, I mean, the idea of socialism hasn't really been something you can talk about in America for a very long time. And then if you think about Trump, coming from not just the right wing. I mean, Trump is not a traditional conservative by any stretch of the imagination. He represents a far right tendency in American politics that hasn't really had the presidency for a long time. As thuggish and as brutal as Democratic and Republican presidents have been since the last 100 years or so, I don't think even that sort of ordinary, mundane power politics, our mode of power politics, has really a shade on what Trump and co are up to in the White House. So we have a sort of a historical reawakening, if that's fair to say. And I think what the globalization module does is it sort of puts on the table for us certain questions, as I was saying, that have been off the table. And those questions are the questions of the far right and the questions of the left. America has, by and large, been a sort of center-right capitalist economy, advocating global leadership and globalization, the globalization of the US economy, the globalization of the American way of life, American culture, since World War II. And it was doing that as a way to try to win the Cold War. That's by no means a controversial remark. I mean, that's just, I think that's established as truth. American leadership has sort of continued in the world since the end of the Cold War, but many people were worried or thinking that might come to an end at a certain point, and it seems today that we're reaching that point. So what does it mean to have sort of economic nationalism? What does it mean to have socialism? Again, Bernie Sanders on one end, Donald Trump on the other, sort of back in the American discourse after being gone for such a very long time. Well, we'll see. I think that this module will bring to the surface some of these questions. And they tend to emerge when you start to think about what we talked about with Kegley, how taken for granted the globalization of technologies, of communications, of markets was in Kegley, and how we were entering a new world order, and how, in a sense, part and parcel of that globalization that Kegley was talking about was also, I think, a recognition of the mutuality of risks in a nuclear era. If a nuclear power station melts down in Fukushima, Japan, maybe you don't want to eat fish from the, west coast of the United States anymore. The Pacific Ocean, a lot of people avoid the fish there. Similarly, back in the 80s, you had the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown, the worst nuclear accident in human history. It didn't just affect people in the Ukraine. It affected it affected sheep farmers in Wales, thousands of miles away. So, similarly, we have holes in the ozone layer that we've had to deal with as a global community. We continue to have, and we will. I think it'll get worse. We have global warming. And all of this combines to sort of create a sense of the gravity of what it might mean for specifically Donald Trump's mode of American leadership to be pulling us back from commitments to globalization, commitments to building institutions that govern, that monitor, that police the world economy. Trump seems to be genuinely terrified of globalization as a kind of a vector for immigration and undermining American jobs, and he has campaigned on that. And I think certainly there are arguments to be had in relation to those questions. Has globalization been fair? Has it been carried out? Has it been institutionalized in a way that takes due consideration of the fact that people lose their jobs in globalization, right? The jobs go to where the jobs are cheap, where the labor is cheap. I don't know that those are illegitimate questions to be asking. In fact, I think in my own academic career, I've spent a long time talking and debating people about these issues. So certainly they're legitimate questions, We look at the rise of Trump. We look at the British Brexit phenomena last year. The British people voted to leave the European Union. There's a palpable sense in Europe and in America of the rise of the right. And many people would say that globalization is sort of the driving force here. Because why, right? Because it has been done in a highly technocratic manner that has put, almost like by way of an assumption of its own sort of self-importance, that economic reason, right? The instrumentality of markets has been placed ahead of democracy and democratic reason and democratic debate as a sort of an order of priority. So we have given our sovereignty, if you will, to the markets. And so now the jobs go where the jobs are cheapest for the corporations that want to build things for us, right? Of course, the sting in the tail there is that if none of us have jobs, we can't buy the stuff that the corporations are producing for us. I think that's critical. So a bit depressing, perhaps, right? I mean, none of this feels good right now. Globalization was a problem. We were critical of globalization. We thought it was unfair. We thought it was undemocratic. We made these arguments since the 80s, since the 70s, in fact, with the fall of the Bretton Woods system. And now we find ourselves in a situation where, because globalization couldn't respond, because the powers that be, the sort of powers that the likes of Hillary Clinton represented in her 2016 election campaign, the inevitability of Goldman Sachs, the inevitability of the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, all these sorts of global players, these global institutions of finance, these global banks, these global corporations. Hillary was close to them. We know that she was giving these $600,000 speeches to Goldman Sachs and wouldn't tell us what she was saying in them. And then WikiLeaks leaked the contents of some of these speeches, and we kind of, not to get conspiratorial about it, but we kind of found out what we always suspected, right? We had empirical confirmation of what we most deeply feared was true about Hillary Clinton, and that was that she was a technocrat. On the side of the elites, the financial elites of Wall Street, telling them that it wasn't their fault that the economy collapsed in 2008, meanwhile trying to keep up with Bernie Sanders out of the other side of her mouth and say, we need to regulate the banks, we need to control the power of capital in our economy, we need to increase the minimum wage, for example. Well, you can't have it both ways, right? If you're saying one thing privately to one group of people and one thing publicly to another, and that comes out, you lose credibility. So that's fuel to the fire then of people who were upset enough already that maybe they thought that the Democrats were not really invested in the mission of protecting jobs in America, of protecting middle class incomes. So Bernie withdrew, and Hillary got the nomination and lost quite badly, actually, when you think about it. Now, some people make hay of this idea that, well, she won the popular vote. Okay, but when you look at the actual number of votes she got relative to the size of the electorate, the registered voter base, she got her proverbial ass handed to her, right? Because, and why do I say that? That might sound like a controversial thing. I mean, I imagine if we were in a real class here, you'd be sticking your hands up right now going, how can you say that? Well, I would say it simply on the strength of the figures. She lost what many Democratic analysts had called after the 2008 and 2012 elections the firewall. The firewall was Obama's 7 to 8 million vote lead over the Republicans, which many people had thought was impregnable, and ultimately was the reason why Hillary Clinton's campaign never went to Wisconsin, for example, because they assumed that those votes were in the bag, that those votes were safe. It wasn't even considered a battleground state. Well, Trump saw that his populist message was resonating there. He saw that Hillary was weak in a certain sense from the Bernie Sanders flank, and Bernie Sanders wasn't in the election anymore. So he stepped in there and started saying things critical of Goldman Sachs, things that were critical of globalization and the difficulty that American workers have in globalization. American industrial workers, Rust Belt workers have in making cars cheap enough to compete with Southeast Asian laborers, for example. And it worked, right? It didn't have to work in a super convincing way. It just had to work just enough, I think, to persuade American voters that that Trump was worth a shot, and they were angry enough to do it. And so, as I tell my students, and I hope you'll indulge me some foul language here. I'll try not to use too much foul language in this class, of course, but the 2016 election was a fuck you election, right? I don't think people really thought Trump was going to be a good candidate. If you look at the numbers, he actually did worse than Romney. He did worse than McCain. Trump would have lost this election under most normal circumstances. Not just lost, he would have lost royally. I mean, his numbers were not good. He's a highly unpopular figure, even among his base. We shouldn't play down the fact that millions of people abstained in this election. Hillary Clinton should have done at least 5 to 6 million votes better than it turns out at the end of the day she did. Obama had a 7 million lead over his rivals. People say Hillary won the popular vote, but I think when you look at the facts, yeah, she did win the popular vote. But like, what does that mean, right? What does that mean if you can't keep the coalition that Obama put together, right? If your credibility is so damaged that people will sooner or prefer to abstain. There's anecdotes about Michigan, for example, 90,000 votes in Michigan, where people voted downstream, down ticket. They voted for the mayor, they voted for the sheriff, they voted for the dog catcher, they voted for the governor, they voted for the senators, and they left their presidential slot blank. So millions of people didn't participate in this election. And there's huge. I mean, if you guys want, just email me and I can send you some articles about this stuff. I've got a lot of it. So globalization is on the table as this is what I'm trying to emphasize to you, because it's so important as we go into this module. And the chapter that Cynthia Weber wrote was written before globalization was a question. Right? Do you see what I'm saying? So globalization is a question today because of Trump, because of Bernie Sanders. Even though they are on like totally opposite ends of the spectrum, they both represent anti-elitist tendencies in contemporary politics. One great book on this subject that you guys could read if you were feeling up to it, not right now, but like over the summer, an Irishman who passed away recently by the name of Peter Mayer, Peter M-A-I-R, Peter Mayer, and his book is so interesting. It's the last book he finished before he passed suddenly and unhappily there just last year. And he makes this argument that that democracy since the 18th century has been premised on a participation of the masses in the big decisions, and the premise of our struggle has been to increase the participation across the board in those big decisions. But since the 1970s, we have been taking the power of democracy away, right? We've been putting some things beyond question, economic things beyond question. And I think people have just gotten so upset with it now that they are turning to desperate options to try to take the power back. And that would be my criticism, or my master statement, if you will, on Trump. Okay, so that's kind of an introduction. Now let's just recap where we were over the last few weeks. We've talked about realism. We've talked about, within that, the clash between neorealism and realism. And we talked about the movie Lord of the Flies. And we questioned whether it was a realist or a neorealist film. It turns out, with Cynthia Weber's interpretation, there's maybe some good reasons for thinking that Lord of the Flies isn't just about the importance of anarchy as a permissive cause of war, right? We talked about idealism. We looked at Independence Day as a film, and we found that maybe as a model or a case study of idealism, that Independence Day has a plot that turns on the significance or the importance of the United States of America in creating a human resistance to the aliens. And we wondered maybe at the end of the day then if, because of that reason, that maybe it wasn't an idealist case study after all. We've talked about constructivism, fascinating chapter, when Stan thinks he can be the producer of a truth that will challenge the very foundations of what American citizens understand their nation to be, he's going to tell everyone, and he comes up against the deep cultural power, the congealed cultural power of the state, which has the autonomy because of this power to extinguish his life. And we looked at those three theories. All of them are anarchy theories, right? They're all to do with whether anarchy is unavoidable, whether anarchy is mitigatable, or whether anarchy is what we make of it. The last module, we took a turn. We started to look at gender as a variable, and we thought about how gender is policed by certain IR theorists as a variable, putting in its place, right? That they want to say that gender can be used. Sure, you can use gender to explain the traditional questions of war and peace. But what you can't do is you can't ask whether those questions of war and peace are themselves somehow constitutive of an understanding of the world that is itself violent to women. And this we expressed through the idea or message of kind of a soup metaphor, right? Is it just a question of adding gender to the soup to make it taste better, i.e. to explain war and peace better? Or to continue the metaphor, is it a question that the soup itself is poisoned, and that those questions of war and peace are complicit in reproducing a world where women are constantly on the brunt of violence? As you know, if you go back to the start of that lecture and you remember the statistics that we looked at about how many women die in war, how many children die in war, how war and the expense that we go through Donald Trump's talking about expanding the US military budget to an unprecedented degree. Well, those are all, expenses that must come from somewhere, and they're coming from. He proposes to cut welfare. He proposes to cut healthcare. He proposes to, do things that are going to constrain the domain of activity that we typically attribute to feminine labor, right? And the reproduction of our health, the nurturing of our children. And in that sense, you see, I think, what the gender question involves, right? That we don't just... I think it becomes very obvious, doesn't it, at a certain point, that gender isn't just a way to explain whether wars happen or don't happen. Gender actually invites us to think about IR from a whole new perspective, and to think that those thousands of year old questions that we've been asking since the time of Thucydides kind of distracted us away from criticizing the actual costs of war and peace, right? The costs of perpetually preparing for military conflict or stabilizing military conflict through an arms race, for example. And the actual cost of what we have called in our very introductory lecture, week one, what we call the statesman's view, the statesman's gaze. At this very center of it is a rationale or a logic, what some philosophers would call an epistemology, that is incredibly destructive to the feminine values, the feminine domain of our social life. So a lot at stake there. Now this week we turn to, as I said, globalization, which is back on the map, and this is sort of, again, moving away from our preoccupation with anarchy to start to look at some other thematic questions. If gender was our first non-anarchy module, and if gender sort of brought us to our midterm exam halfway through the course. This is the first topic. Globalization is the first topic of our part 2 of the course. And for this topic, we are looking at the film The Truman Show, which I don't know if you have seen it before. Hopefully you have, but it's a fantastic film, and I think if you haven't seen it, you're going to love it. And we're using The Truman Show to explore issues in the thesis of globalization, and our theorist that we're looking at here is a guy that became really famous at the time of the end of the Cold War, so late 80s, early 90s. He was George Bush Sr.'s national security advisor. Quite a well-known guy, a well-known academic, a career academic, very accomplished, and someone who's taken very seriously in the field. So we will go through Fukuyama's hypothesis about the end of history. We'll compare it to other dialectical theories of history, because that's what Fukuyama is. He's a dialectical theorist. I'll explain what that means. Fukuyama is a Hegelian, but there are others like Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a dialectical theorist, but in a very, very different way. So I'm going to take some time to explain that one to you. So we're going to try to unpack then the idea of it being the end of history, where this idea comes from, what kind of conceptualization of history Fukuyama is using. We're going to try to critically engage with how Fukuyama makes the myth of a liberal, or what some people would even call neoliberal, because liberalism, when it's victorious in the era of globalization, has tended to be called neoliberalism. I don't want you guys to get too hung up on the contrast between liberalism and neoliberalism. Both of them are economic theories that put the marketplace at the heart of human life and say we ought to live according to the rules of the market. And there's nuances, but we don't need to worry about them too much for this module. So where does liberal or neoliberal market ideology fit into globalization? And then we're going to ask the question of whether liberalism might be here forever or not. And I think, keeping in mind the things that I said in my introduction, I mean, I mentioned those things because I have to, right? Cynthia Weber's chapter was written before Bernie Sanders and before Donald Trump, several years beforehand. So we have to ask those questions. You know, what do Sanders and Trump and Sanders, what do they signify? What does it mean that they were so popular, and that the established way of doing things in the United States of America is sort of up for grabs now in a way as never before? Well, let's talk about globalization. First of all, what is globalization? I think it's something that's very hard to define. It refers to, as your textbook says, anything from the internet to a hamburger. Perhaps it's best to start a consideration about globalization with, its bookend, so to speak. And the bookend of globalization is the end of the Cold War. It was then that we really started taking the idea of globalization seriously. My understanding is that the term globalization has been around for a long time. You can find it mentioned before the end of the Cold War, or at least implied by certain people like Marshall McLuhan, who was a communication theorist. He, for example, coined the phrase the global village, and there's others we could talk about as well. So it's old. It's an old term. Many critics of the concept would say that even imperialism in the 19th and 18th centuries was an expression of a kind of a globalization, because in fact, if you were interested in looking at the metric tons of commerce that were being moved around the planet relative to the population, there was actually more moving around in the 19th century than there is today. That's my understanding. Now, whether that could have been updated more recently, but at least 8 years ago or so, that was still the case. And that's despite the fact that we have these super tankers and these super car ferries that bring cars, people all over the planet. That despite the fact that we have financial transactions on a global basis that are epically huge and dwarf anything in human history, in terms of actual tonnage of commodities, grain, cotton, silks, spices. We used to move actually more back in the day proportionately to our population. So maybe globalization started hundreds of years ago. Maybe it started with the Roman Empire. Maybe it started with migrations from Mesopotamia to Europe. These are important questions, right? There's economic, geographic, social, political, cultural histories to be unpacked here. And it's complicated. So I think it's okay, for the purpose of this class, that we agree that the globalization we're referring to is the globalization that became part of our vernacular after the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's where most people start to use the term, and I think that's okay, keeping in mind that that's a story and that it can be challenged and that it's not necessarily true in a strict sense. I think so long as we use it as a helpful term, keeping in mind that it's up for question, then I think that's okay. Now, actually, it's interesting. An old professor of mine is cited in Cynthia Weber's book at the beginning of your Globalization chapter. Gerard Toll, or Geroid O'Toole, if you wanted to know his Irish name. He wrote a famous piece way back in the 90s arguing that globalization was, and I quote, a floating sign of many different problematics. And I think what he really is trying to get at there is that, globalization is a tricky term because it can't mean everything that it's supposed to mean. And we can't know through one term the full complexity of globalization. So it's a strange term. It's an empty signifier, right? It's filled with so many different things, so many different arguments, that it's actually a hard term to use with any legitimacy. So again, we're using it with that footnote, right? The caveat attached that it is a problematic term and we don't want to necessarily be unfaithful to the complexity that globalization implies. So enter Francis Fukuyama and the end of history. There's a great quote on the screen here. I should say I came across Fukuyama when I was probably your age. I was, well, some of you are older than others, some of you are younger than others, but I think I was about 21, 22 when I first read this book. And I was given it as an assignment to read. I was in my first year of my master's degree, and my professor wanted me to write a review of this book, and I had never heard of this guy beforehand, but I had sort of lived through the fall of the Berlin Wall and all these sorts of things, as many people my age were kind of, becoming politically aware, self-aware in and around this time. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a really interesting moment in our lives. So Fukuyama writes a famous essay in 1989 called The End of History, and then he elaborates in this book. It takes him 3 years to write. It comes out in 1992, and I find myself reading this book in like 93, 94. I still have it. I have all the highlights that I was putting in the book at the time. He argues, as it says on the screen, that having seen the fall of the Berlin Wall and having sort of realized that there's no real challengers left in an ideological sense to kind of compromise or take on global capitalist democracy, that probably means that in the sense of political life, history is at an end. If you look at the quote here, he's basically asking, well, we could read it together, I suppose. If we are now at a point where we cannot imagine a world substantially different from our own, in which there is no apparent or obvious way in which the future will represent a fundamental improvement over our current order, then we must also take into consideration the possibility that history, capital H, history itself, might be at an end. So what's going on with this capital H history? I think that's a crucial question, because it's not history in the sense of time, I think, that he's talking about. And by time, of course, we mean seconds, hours, days, weeks, months, years, centuries, chronological time. That history is going to continue, right? And there's no doubt about it. Fukuyama's not arguing that the clocks are going to stop or something. But it's history more in the sense of what I think, the Greeks called kairos, K-A-I-R-O-S. And that's the time of human experience. That's the sense of the era that we live in. Kairos, or kairotic time, is the time of your identity, right? Who are we, right? If we live in a feudalistic society with a king or a queen, we might be a peasant, right? We might have loyalty to the king or queen. We tend not to question that. It's natural for us to live in an order with a king or a queen. People didn't go around all day long in the era of kings or queens over the era of over a stretch of hundreds of years, thinking, gee, I wish we had democracy, right? Because people needed that hadn't been invented yet, right? The idea of democracy hadn't come along. The proposition of democracy as a sort of a better way to be hadn't really come along yet. Not in the modern sense. Of course, there was former iterations of democracy with the Greeks. But most people weren't literate and wouldn't have known about those. So our era is historically significant because it shapes and molds our hopes, our dreams, our way of relating to our culture, our sense of what is right and what's wrong, and what the possibilities are. So Fukuyama, I think, is saying, in that sense, capital H history, human political history, social cultural history is over. And the winner of history, if you will, has been liberal democracy, liberal capitalist democracy. It has, he says, won an unabashed victory over other ideas. Liberalism is the only legitimate ideology left in the world, for two reasons. One, because it has no one to come along and challenge it, Now, this, of course, was written before 9/11, and many people said after 9/11, haha, you see, religion's coming back. Maybe religion's going to restart this. But, Islamic terrorism hasn't really been a huge threat so far. It has failed to really mount a mortal threat to the Western world, right? It's not going to kill off the West. That we can see right now anyway. Their goal, the extremist Islam, its goal was not to destroy the West actually, but to get the West to retaliate against 9/11, for example, and be so brutal in the pursuit of its war that it would create a recruitment effect for Islamic terrorism and drive more and more people into it. But so far as we've seen this, its most extreme expression so far has been ISIS, and ISIS do not seem to be very effective in achieving their goals. They haven't, for example, been able to defeat Assad in Syria. They haven't. Their caliphate seems very fragile and vulnerable to traditional military power, and it's unclear that they can. It's unclear that they can hold the line. So we don't. I think we still live in a world maybe where Fukuyama's hypothesis about there being challengers to liberalism is probably still holding true, although Trump, I think, is definitely not a liberal president in that sense. I think George W. Bush would have been. George W. Bush's father, Reagan, they call themselves conservatives, but even conservatism comes out of the liberal tradition in that sense, if you look at its classic 18th century origins. Trump would probably be the most illiberal president that the United States has had for a very long time. So let's give Fukuyama the benefit of the doubt anyway. Despite Trump, despite ISIS, despite Bernie Sanders, that contemporary democratic capitalist liberalism is still very much with us, and we're living at the end of history still. A second proposition that Fukuyama puts on the table to try to give us over to an idea that liberalism has won is that liberalism itself contains no seeds within it that might produce dissatisfaction with it. We call those contradictions, right? That liberalism might be treating people a certain way that's inconsistent with its own base values, and consequently it's going to produce within it the seeds of its own destruction, which would be kind of a Marxist argument actually. So think about that for a second. No external challengers, no ISIS. Trump may or may not be, a factor. Bernie Sanders was a socialist, but he wasn't a communist. So the threats really aren't there externally. What about internally? That's what we're trying to say. Are there internal contradictions? Fukuyama says that could be possible, but on his estimation, it isn't. So together, no ideological challengers to liberalism, and liberalism itself appears to be free enough of contradictions that no one can come up with a better system. He says, and I quote, "It would seem to dictate then this universal evolution in the direction of capitalism." That's from the text. That's from his book. So for Fukuyama, then, we've reached this endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution, and this means that liberalism is, and I quote, the final form of human government. So the takeaway message, the upshot, the conclusion that we draw from his discussion is that if history of conflict of ideas is over, right, we're not going to have debates anymore about other forms of human government, then what is there left to do in political science except fine-tuning, right? To spread liberal ideology all over the world, maybe because there's still a couple of holdout places like Cuba, North Korea, where it hasn't spread yet, but basically it's just a matter of time till they're gone. We step in, we implement it eventually, and probably pretty soon it's going to be globally, materially real, right? This way of life. It's going to have material instantiation. It's going to be a material truth, not just an idea in our heads, but literally all over the globe, evenly spread all over the globe. The American way of life, global capitalism, whatever you want to call it, right? Globalization is going to become a global reality. So all we have to do is fine-tune and live in this, right? Now, we have, I think, a choice here. Maybe Fukuyama is persuasive to us. Maybe we like what he's saying and it's persuasive. I admit I find it persuasive sometimes. But I want to give Cynthia Weber the benefit of the doubt because I think she's got a kind of a couple of really good points to make. And one of them I'm going to kind of get into right now, actually, which is this question of whether this question of being at the end of the history is kind of a sneaky thing to do because it effectively contrives to suppress debate, right? So that's a point that Cynthia Weber really emphasizes, and I want to take you through that right now. So the question on this slide is whether liberalism is de-ideological or not. What might that mean? Well, I think when you say something is ideological, you're saying that it's a type of politics. And we often use ideology as an insult, right? We can say, oh, you're just being ideological. As if, when I accuse you of being ideological, I'm not ideological, right? I'm whatever I'm saying is truth, so to speak. I think it's healthy in political science to give everyone the benefit of the doubt and to say everyone's ideological. That my truth is not any more to be taken for granted as ideology as anyone else's, right? So that means that what I would be agreeing in that proposition is that I have a point of view that I can argue for, that I think it's pretty valid. You have a different point of view to me. But out of respect for each other, we say, look, I'm representing a point of view here. I believe it's true, but I also recognize that you're coming from somewhere and that your political proposition is coming from a thought-through perspective, right? That you're not just kind of emotionally reacting or just shooting the shit, right? That you've actually taken time to sit down and talk it through, that you represent a consciously thought through framework of thought, right? Comprehensively thought through, comprehensively planned. You've thought about potential responses to my point of view, for example, and you're ready to engage me in a kind of a debate. So it's respectful to say to someone else, I recognize your point of view as a legitimate ideology, right? A legitimate ideological perspective. And it's for that reason that I don't use the term ideological as an insult. Some people do. Fukuyama, I mention all of this, by the way, because this is one of Cynthia Weber's big points about Fukuyama, that he tries to take his perspective out of the ideological mix, right? Now, you and I might like to dust it up, right? Like, you might not agree with me, I might not agree with you, we're going to get kind of bare-knuckle boxing, we're going to get into a debate, throw it back and forth a bit. Cool. Fukuyama's saying, no, I'm not doing that. you guys can get your bare knuckle boxing on. I'm packing my bags and taking over, right? My ideology won. You guys, can still debate it out, but I'm going up to talk to the big boys about policy now and about how my ideas can help shape the world. So enjoy. So Fukuyama's kind of declaring victory and going home, if you're familiar with that expression. And he's doing that because he believes that globalization is here to stay, global liberalism is here to stay, that the Western model of government, liberal democracy, is here today with us as the final form of human government, as I was saying in the last slide. He does acknowledge that there's ways in which global liberalism hasn't fully taken form yet. But as I said, because there are these examples of North Korea and Cuba and places like this where other ideologies are still holding out. Syria with ISIS, for example, in their so-called caliphate. So religious enclaves and communistic enclaves still exist in the world. Stalinist enclaves still exist in the world vis-a-vis North Korea, which is probably not really communist, but more like just a Stalinist dictatorship at this stage. But, says Fukuyama, two major reasons why the existence of those enclaves doesn't really matter for his argument. First, because liberalism has, without question, won the intellectual debate, right? The Nazis lost World War II, and once the Berlin Wall fell, it revealed the internal flaws of communism. So those two events right there, with the exception maybe of 9/11, show that, there's no real serious intellectual response to liberalism coming, whether from the right or from the left, from the Nazis or from the communists. And ISIS really hasn't showed up radical Islam as a global ideology, right? It's local, it's regional, specific, but it's not really a challenge to history in that sense. I'll grant Fukuyama that point. So for both of those reasons then, because there's no intellectual challenger and spatially material challenges haven't really shown up that are going to compromise this. So there's linkages then here between Fukuyama's account of the victory of globalization and the end of history and what Kegley had been talking to us about in Module 2, in the formal Module 2, Idealism. Cynthia Weber doesn't really mention this, but if you read Fukuyama's book, which again I did a long time ago, it was very influential at the time, and that time was the time of Kegley as well, right? And both scholars, if you read their work, you see that information technology, the invention of the fax machine, it was the beginning of the Pentium age, the Intel microprocessor 486, for those of you who remember. These were all kind of coming into existence. Well, 486, 386 wouldn't even have been around then. This was like still Radio Shack, Tandy, TRX-80 computers, home computers. They were still very, very new in the late 80s, early 90s. But things were changing very quickly. Windows 98 was just around the corner, you guys. So people were impressed with these radical new technologies and their potentials, and they had a sense that these technologies would allow communication to happen in a much more easy way, and would allow ideas about global democracy to spread. So for those reasons, lack of intellectual challenge to globalization, the reality that globalization was still kind of maybe one or two challenges lingering here or there, but they wouldn't hold out for long, And then finally, this idea, I suppose, that it's information technology driven in some respects, are enabled by information technology. Fukuyama is very optimistic that it's really just a matter of time until globalization is here, and there's affinities with Kegley in that sense. So the takeaway message then is, because liberalism has kind of fulfilled itself, that it's a complete project, that it has no further questions outstanding about how to sort of fundamentally modify it or anything, that it's really now down to questions of refinement. Scholarly attention, philosophical attention isn't about the big picture questions anymore. It's now going to be directed to the micro policy, how to fine-tune the processes of liberal governance, the institutions of the global free market, for example, etc. And this really is where we get to the question of the de-ideological. Because once you've said that it's global, that it has no more challengers, that it can't be perfected really, it's just going to be fine-tuned, that does serve to shut down discussion to a certain extent about how we might envision the future of our global economy, right? For example, globally it means that certain questions about policies that create regional free trade, for example, like NAFTA, or like the European Union, or global institutions like the World Trade Organization, those are all going to be off the table. Those institutions are here to stay from Fukuyama's perspective, and we should just get used to it, right? American leadership is invested in them. American companies do very well from the free trade that they oversee. And that's the rhetoric we were using from the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall through to 2016 and the election of Trump, frankly, right? Trump does not like NAFTA, and would probably be the first American president in that whole time, whether Republican or Democrat, to even question whether NAFTA is a good thing, right? Because Republicans and Democrats have both had very strong support for NAFTA at the center of their global trade agendas. That's no secret, and that's no conspiracy theory. That's just the way they saw the world. They wrote about it all the time that way. Trump doesn't seem to like these things at all. One of his first acts in office was to shut down the so-called TTIP, which was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that was huge. That was you cannot understate the significance of that move politically. So guys, we're at the end of our first part of this class here. We've just discussed how Fukuyama closes down debate about whether liberalism is in question or not, right? And because he's taking liberalism off the table, we can say he's making it de-ideological. That was my point in this slide. So we'll be back in part 2 to speak about the comprehension of history that makes Fukuyama's de-ideological claims about liberalism possible. Thanks very much.